Foundations of Ibn Taymiyya's Religious Utilitarianism. Dr. John Hoover, Nottingham University. Introduction. Sophia Wassalow, in her recent monograph on the theological ethics of the Damascene theologian Ibn Taymiyya, died 1328, insightfully observes that his view of God's morality resembles in the utilitarianism of the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham, died 1832. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, God in his wise purpose weighs up the good and the evil in order to choose the preponderant good, and the good that God does in the world far exceeds the evil. Wassalow, 2016, writes, and quote, Ibn Taymiyyah's account of God's morality echoes nothing if not the axiom of utilitarianism articulated by Bentham. And quote, it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. End quote. Findings of my own work on Ibn Taymiyyah's theology reinforce and extend the aptness of Wassalow's assessment. God creates the world in the best possible way. God creates evil and metes out punishment to deter, instruct, purify, and spur on to repentance. And God's mercy and wise purpose preclude chastising anyone in hellfire forever. The goal towards which God creates and commands is universal human salvation and total worship of God that gives God his full due as God. The greatest happiness that God maximizes for the greatest number is fundamentally religious in character. Utilitarian thinking has also been observed in Ibn Taymiyyah's ethical and jurisprudential deliberation. Michael Cook notes, Ibn Taymiyyah's exhortation to weigh up the benefits, masalih, and detriments, mafasid, of acts in order to choose the greater of two goods or the lesser of two evils. Cook relates an anecdote to illustrate the point. During a Mongol invasion of Syria, Ibn Taymiyyah visited the camp of the Mongols and found them drunk. One of his comrades wanted to rebuke the Mongols for drinking alcohol, but Ibn Taymiyyah countered that they should be left to drink. If the Mongols were to stop drinking, they would be able to inflict even more harm on the Muslims. Cook also observes that Ibn Taymiyyah has none of the traditional humbly uneasiness about political power. Public offices are fundamentally religious in character, and Ibn Taymiyyah insisted that these offices be given to the candidates best able to do the job. Neither those too scrupulous to engage political reality effectively, nor those who ignore morality in the name of political expediency. Cook, 2154-157. Yahya Mikot has highlighted and translated a number of texts bringing out utilitarian reasoning in Ibn Taymiyyah. In a study of texts on the ethics of quitting bad company, Mikot, 2006-20, speaks of Ibn Taymiyyah's profound utilitarianism and shows how he calls for weighing up the benefits and detriments in each situation. One should ordinarily abandon the company of the disobedient and the perverse to avoid corruption, but not if there is preponderant benefit in staying in contact, or even if greater detriment would ensue from leaving. Mikot, 2006. In other passages translated by Mikot, Ibn Taymiyyah argues against insurrection because the detriment entailed always exceeds the detriment of leaving an unjust ruler in office. And in the course of discussing the Prophet Joseph in Egypt, he gives instruction on choosing the preponderant benefit when faced with competing obligations. Also, at the end of a treatise on the Caliphate, Ibn Taymiyyah identifies benefit-detriment analysis and adapting the law to circumstances as the way of the Prophet himself. Mikot. We will return to this treatise below. The consistency of Ibn Taymiyyah's utilitarianism across the divine and human levels is remarkable within the Ash'ari dominated context of his time. Because Ash'ari voluntarism does not admit of God acting for purposes or according to any recognizable moral criteria. The aim of the present investigation is to explore the conceptual foundations of utilitarianism in Ibn Taymiyyah's theology, jurisprudence, and ethics. First, how he overcomes Ash'ari voluntarist objections to formulate a coherent theology of a God acting toward utilitarian ends. And then, how he justifies utilitarian ethical and jurisprudential deliberation at the human level. In view of his conviction that revelation has already indicated everything of human benefit, I will consider how Ibn Taymiyyah upholds God's purposive activity against Ash'ari voluntarism through exposition of his treatise Al-Irada wal-Amr, dating to 714/1315. This treatise has the advantage of tackling the major issues directly and comprehensively, even if not as fully as in some of Ibn Taymiyyah's other works. This study of Irada will show that Ibn Taymiyyah's divine utilitarianism is grounded in a perpetually dynamic vision of God that is made conceptually possible by integrating features of the medieval Islamic philosophical tradition, that is falsafa. The second part of the study takes up Ibn Taymiyyah's ethics and jurisprudence. Wesselo argues in her recent monograph that Ibn Taymiyyah's claims to rational discernment of ethical value are very thin, because revelation in fact specifies the full range of human benefit. The centrality of maslaha, benefit, utility and welfare in Ibn Taymiyyah's ethics is ultimately a rationalization of the revealed law, in the interest of the piety that flows out of the belief that reason and revelation coincide. While Wesselo is correct on this key point, she does not push through to Ibn Taymiyyah's conviction that utilitarianism itself is the way of the Prophet, as noted already by Mikut, and that this opens the door to substantial ethical and jurisprudential reflection in the face of dilemmas thrown up by sin and human weakness. I will illustrate this through exposition of Ibn Taymiyyah's treatise on the Caliphate. This will make apparent that the character of human utilitarianism is in certain respects similar to the utilitarianism of God. God's utilitarianism rooted in God's perpetual dynamism. Ibn Taymiyyah's Al-Irada wal-Amr runs to 78 printed pages in the 8th volume of the large collection of his works, Majmu' al-Fatawa. Ibn Taymiyyah says that the focus of this treatise, causality ta'leel in the will of God, encompasses everything theological, jurisprudential, and eschatological. It relates to theological issues of God's name and attributes, and God's creation and determination of all things, to legal and moral questions of surrounding God's command and prohibition, and to eschatological matters of reward and punishment. It is also at the core of controversies over God's power, justice, and love in theology, and whether legal rulings derive from a wise purpose, a benefit maslaha, and a cause illah, or from God's sheer will. Ibn Taymiyyah, 1961 to 1967, 881 to 82. The occasion of Irada is a trilemma presented to Ibn Taymiyyah in the year 714 or 1315. The three prongs of the trilemma are as follows. First, if God created without cause, God would be aimless, which cannot be true. Second, if God created for a cause and this cause were eternal, then the effect would likewise be eternal. That would mean that the world is eternal, which is also problematic. On the other hand, and third, if God created for a cause and this cause were originated in time, then it would follow that this cause must itself have a cause, and so forth into an infinite regress. However, the trilemma asserts an infinite regress is impossible. Here is the trilemma given to Ibn Taymiyyah in direct quotation. Concerning the goodness of the will of God, exalted is He in creating creatures and bringing forth the human race. Does He create for a cause, illah, or for other than a cause? If it is said not for a cause, He is aimless. Exalted is God above that. If it is said for a cause, and if you say that it is eternal, lam yazal, it follows necessarily that effect is eternal. And third, and if you say that it is temporally originated, muhaddas, it follows necessarily that it had a cause. But an endless chain is absurd. At the end of Irada, Ibn Taymiyya observes that not all three prongs of the trilemma can be false. At least one of them must be true. Number 1, God is aimless. Number 2, world is eternal. Number 3, an infinite regress is possible. Ibn Taymiyya explicitly rejects the eternity of the world, but beyond that he is uncharacteristically reticent. He does not come down firmly in favor of God's aimlessness, an unflattering description of Ash'ari voluntarism, or for an infinite regress. Instead, he concludes that such questions must be approached gradually and investigated from all sides until the truth appears. To whom, and quote, to whomever God wills to guide. Perhaps Ibn Taymiyya was wary of repercussions from the Ash'ari-dominated establishment. Should he come out firmly against the first view, nevertheless the body of Irada makes eminently clear that his sympathies lie with an infinite regress. Early in the treatise, Ibn Taymiyya outlines the three groups that correspond to the three prongs of the opening trilemma. These are, number 1, the voluntarists who deny causality in God's will, which is the view of the Ash'ari Kalam theologians. Second, the philosophers who affirm the eternity of the world. And third, those who affirm that God creates and commands for a praiseworthy purpose. Among this last group are the Mu'tazilis. We will start with the philosophers. Ibn Taymiyya does not mention any philosophers by name, but he clearly has in view philosophers of a post-Avicennian ilk who think in terms of complete causality. He explains that the philosophers affirm both the eternity of the final cause of the world and eternity of the efficient cause. The originator of the world is thus a complete cause, illah tama, which means that it necessitates its effect without any delay in time. Otherwise, if the cause were not present in eternity in all its fullness, another cause would have been required to bring about the world. Then, another cause prior to that cause would have been required to bring it into existence, and so on in an infinite regress. Otherwise, the effect would have originated without a cause or a preponderator, murajjah. And for the philosophers, preponderance without a preponderator is absurd. Ibn Taymiyya retorts in Irada that the philosopher's notion of a complete cause necessitates that nothing occur in time at all, and that this is even more obviously false than an infinite regress of causes or preponderance without a preponderator. The philosophers' God as complete cause could never originate temporal events. This is because the effect of a complete cause can never lag behind that cause in time. If something were to occur in time, it would originate without cause or something to originate it. To Ibn Taymiyya, this is absurd, and no attempt to introduce intermediaries into the system, as the philosophers do, will alleviate the problem. In making God a complete cause, the philosophers cannot explain how events occur in time. Moreover, Ibn Taymiyya argues an infinite regress of temporally originating events should pose no difficulties to the philosophers because they posit the similar notion of eternal motion in the heavenly spheres. He also claims that an infinite regress of events fits better with divine revelation, as revelation indicates that the origination of the heavens and the earth in 6 days followed on from prior events and causes. Moreover, it is in fact better to say that God created this world for a prior cause that originated in time than to say that this world is eternal and devoid of originating events. Ibn Taymiyya claims that reason as well as revelation finds this more plausible. Reason also affirms that nothing occurs in time without a prior cause, but it does not assert that an effect must proceed from its cause without any delay in time. On this question of the infinite regress, Ibn Taymiyya opposes Kalam theologians who insist that events must have a beginning. On causal priority, however, he comes down on the side of Kalam against falsafa by insisting that God has a real will. He complains that the philosophers reduce God's will to God's knowledge even though they affirm divine final causality. For Ibn Taymiyyah, a God who acts on behalf of a final cause, illa ghaya, or what he calls a desired wise purpose, hikmah matluba, must necessarily be possessed of a will. The final causality of God for Ibn Taymiyyah is not merely a causality drawing creatures to God. It is also a causality orienting the operation of God's own will. We now shift to the group affirming that God creates and commands for a cause or praiseworthy wise purpose. Ibn Taymiyyah says that this view is held by Muslims from each of the four Sunni law schools as well as Mu'tazilis, Karamis, Hadith experts, Sufis, Quran exegetes, most of the ancient philosophers and even some later philosophers like Abul Barakat al-Baghdadi, died 1165. Ibn Taymiyyah's sympathies clearly lie with this group. Nonetheless, he singles out the Mu'tazilis for censure. He criticizes the Mu'tazilis for imposing human standards of good and bad on God, obligating God to do the best, aslah for humans, and limiting God's power and will. He also denounces the Mu'tazilis for maintaining that God's wise purpose is something created and disjoined from him, makhluq munfasil anhu, and that God created the world for the wise purpose of benefiting creatures, without any judgment redounding from that to him, and without any act or attribute subsisting in him. The Mu'tazilis are concerned to protect God's absolute unity, and like the Asharis, they hold that God cannot be a locus or substrat for temporal origination. Thus, the Mu'tazilis locate God's purpose, which is temporally originated outside God's essence. God's purpose is disjoined from God, and it does not subsist in him. Furthermore, according to the Mu'tazilis, God cannot gain anything from acting for a purpose because God has no need of anything. Ibn Taymiyyah rejects this Mu'tazili God as indifferent and disinterested and therefore imperfect. For Ibn Taymiyyah, acting well toward others is praiseworthy, and praise and benefit naturally redound to agents of good acts. Moreover, Ibn Taymiyyah writes, and quote, "Anyone who commits an act in which there is neither pleasure nor benefit nor profit for himself in any respect, neither sooner nor later is aimless, and he is not praised for this." End quote. Pure altruism is irrational. The only acts that are rational are those that involve some kind of benefit and profit for the agent of the act and not just the recipient. The full theological import of this ethical egoism becomes more apparent in Ibn Taymiyyah's comments on his third group, the voluntarists. In Irada, Ibn Taymiyyah identifies the voluntarists as those who affirm that God creates and commands out of sheer will without cause. Ibn Taymiyyah tells us that this position is held widely among Sunni Kalam theologians and legal scholars, among them Al-Ash'ari died 935 and his followers, and Ibn Hazm died 1064 and the Zahiris. Ibn Taymiyyah outlines the main voluntarist arguments near the beginning of Irada and provides counter-arguments later in the treatise. The first voluntarist argument is as follows. If God had created the world for a cause, he would have been imperfect beforehand, and creating on account of that cause would have perfected him. Putting it another way, positing a cause for creation implies that God was perfected by that cause, which means that he was previously imperfect. Ibn Taymiyyah counters that it is in fact rational that an agent be perfected by his act. To say that God is perfected by his acts is no different from saying that God is perfected by his attributes or his essence. Moreover, an agent who brings things into existence with a wise purpose, that is a cause, is in fact more perfect than one who does not. And it is the essence of perfection that things come into existence at their proper time, not before. With this, Ibn Taymiyyah defangs the voluntarist argument by turning an alleged imperfection into a perfection. A God who acts for causes and wise purposes is eminently more perfect than one who does not. Nonetheless, this would still appear to imply need in God, inasmuch as he acts to gain benefits that he did not previously enjoy. Also, it would seem to make God dependent on creatures and created things for the expression of his perfection through wise acts. It will take up these problems further below. The second voluntarist argument expands on the later two positions in the opening trilemma of Irada. If God had created for a cause that was eternal, the effect would have been eternal as well. The Kalam theologians deny that the relation between God and the world is that of an eternal cause with its eternal effect. Conversely, if God had created for a cause that originated in time, this would cause two problems. First, it would entail some kind of temporal change in God, and it would turn God into a locus of substrat, mahal, for temporarily originating events, hawadis. Second, it would entail an infinite regress of causes, because each originated cause would require a prior cause to bring it into existence, and so on into the infinite past. Asharis and others seek to avoid these problems by positing God's will as a single eternal attribute whose very nature is to specify one thing over another and to bring the world into existence at the appointed moment. Ibn Taymiyyah sets out arguments against this. An eternal divine will simply cannot specify one thing over another without a cause giving rise to that specification, taksis. To deny specifying causes is to throw causality in general into doubt, and that would undermine cosmological proofs for the existence of God. The alternative view, explains Ibn Taymiyyah, is that God's wise purpose and God's act occur by means of God's will and God's power, and all of these things, God's wise purpose, God's acts, God's will, and God's power, subsist in God's essence, just as all other divine attributes subsist in God's essence. On the question of the infinite regress, Ibn Taymiyyah asserts that everyone agrees that causes cannot regress forever. However, an infinite regress of conditions and effects, al-shurut wal-asar, that is, an infinite regress of temporarily originating events, is permitted. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, this is in fact equivalent to the statement of the Salaf, the early Muslims, that, and quote, God has been speaking from eternity when he wills. Acts and other things linked to his will and his power have been subsisting in him from eternity. In Irada, Ibn Taymiyyah also notes that people holding this view say that Kalam arguments against an infinite regress are weak. Ibn Taymiyyah does not provide detailed refutation of these arguments in Irada, but he does do so in his later work Minhaj as-Sunnah. By now it is clear that Ibn Taymiyyah in Irada favors a dynamic view of God in which it is of God's perfection to act by will and power for wise purposes from eternity. All of these elements, God's act, God's will, God's power, and God's wise purpose, subsist in God's essence, and God's act and wise purposes regress into the past without beginning. These are equivalent to events, hawadis, subsisting in God's essence, which in other texts Ibn Taymiyyah prefers to call God's voluntary acts and attributes. Also in other texts, Ibn Taymiyyah works out the implications of this theology for creation. Since God has been creating one thing or another from eternity, there has always been one created thing or another in existence. No single created thing is eternal without beginning. However, the genus of created things has no beginning. Hoover, 2004. Back in Irada, a good part of the middle of the treatise is devoted to the problem of evil. God's creation of the human act and the interplay between human responsibility and God's predetermination of all things. Ibn Taymiyyah's reflection on evil clarify the utilitarian character of God's acts, as he underlines that God sent messengers to bring preponderant benefit. Ibn Taymiyyah writes, and quote, "The messengers, God bless them, were raised up to obtain benefits and perfect them, and to strip away detriments and reduce them to the extent possible." End quote. Similar logic also applies more broadly to things like rain. Rain is certainly profitable overall, even if it sometimes destroys homes and disrupts travelers. Ibn Taymiyyah states the general rule as follows, and quote, "Something whose profit and benefit is general is an intended good and beloved mercy, even if some people are harmed by it." End quote. In short, God, in His wise purpose, maximizes benefit in all that He does. Ibn Taymiyyah affirms in texts that are probably later than Irada that God creates this world in the best possible way, and that evil is essentially non existent. It is nothing but the lack of good. This approach to theodicy is distinctively Neoplatonic and Avicennian, and further resonances with Avicennianism become even more apparent when we move to Ibn Taymiyyah's attempt to ward off the charge that God needs creatures in order to be perfect. The context is a passage toward the end of Irada discussing God's love for humans and human love for God. Ibn Taymiyyah links love to obedience, praise, and worship. Humans express love for God by doing what God commands, and God in turn loves humans who obey Him, praise Him, and laud Him. However, God's love, praise, and laudation of Himself are always far greater than any love, praise, and laudation that humans could give Him. In fact, they are so much greater than that God ultimately has no need of the human contribution. Ibn Taymiyyah writes, and quote, God praises Himself, lauds Himself, and glorifies Himself. Glory be to Him. Exalted is He. He is the sufficient in Himself. Al-Ghani bi nafsihi. He does not need anyone else. On the contrary, everything other than Him is in want of Him. When God rejoices, loves, and is well pleased with His servants, it does not mean that God needs them. On the contrary, it is in fact God who created in them what He loves. Ibn Taymiyyah puts it this way, and quote, God is not perfected by another. It is He who created them, and He it is who guided them and helped them so that they did what He loves, is well pleased with, and rejoices at. These beloved things occurred only by His power, His will, and His creation. End quote. Focusing on God's self-love, Ibn Taymiyyah writes, and quote, what God loves of worship of Him and obedience to Him follows from love for Himself, and love of that is the cause of His love for His believing servants. His love for believers follow from love for Himself. Joseph Bell, in his book Love Theory in Hanbalite Islam, noted already in 1979 that Ibn Taymiyyah's impulse here is Neoplatonic and finds much resonance within Sufism. We may add that it is also Avicennian in as much as God's self-love gives rise to the world as a necessary concomitant. Hoover, 2007. The similarities, however, end there. Whereas the first principle of Avicenna is eternal in a timeless sense, Ibn Taymiyyah envisions the life of God as profoundly historical. God, by virtue of His perfection, is ever active, without beginning and without end. Yet, Ibn Taymiyyah's theology is not the modern process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne, in which the fate of God is dependent upon the fate of the world. For Ibn Taymiyyah, God is the indestructible creator of all things. The perfect and self-sufficient historical process of God's inner life has as its necessary concomitant the best possible creaturely history, a drama in which God is always maximizing human benefit through what He creates and what He commands. This is furthermore the vision of God supported by both revelation and reason. Religious utilitarianism as the way of the prophet. Given that Ibn Taymiyyah clearly differs from Asharis over the roles that purpose, benefit, and causality play in the will of God, it is curious that his views on ethical value are in fact very close to those of later Asharism. As Veselov explains, Ibn Taymiyyah sidelines both the Mu'tazili deontology, in which good and bad are objective qualities of acts themselves, and the subjectivist aspect of Ashari ethics that conceives good and bad as functions of God's command and prohibition. Instead, acts are good or bad and just or unjust by virtue of their outcomes, that is, whether they yield pleasure or pain, benefit or harm. Ibn Taymiyyah's approach to ethical value is decidedly consequentialist, and he is indebted in this directly to the later Ashari, Fakhruddin al-Razi, died 1210, and more distinctly to Al-Ghazali, died 1111, and Avicenna. However, we first take up the puzzle of how later Asharis fit ethical and legal consequentialism together with denial of purpose in God's will. To address this and to fill in important background to Ibn Taymiyyah, I turn to an essay by Ahmad Shamsi, 2014, on wisdom in God's law. Al-Shamsi explores the paradox that Shafi jurists of Mu'tazili inclination do not draw on benefit to derive legal rulings while those of Ash'ari proclivity do. Al-Shamsi identifies two 10th century Shafi jurists influenced by Mu'tazilism, Al-Qafal al-Shashi, died 976, and Abu Bakr Ahmad bin Umar bin Yusuf al-Khafaf, death date unknown. Al-Khafaf and Al-Qafal adopt the Mu'tazili notion that God's purpose in the law is to promote human maslaha, that is benefit, effectively embedding the law within theology. For these Mu'tazili-inspired Shafis, reason knows acts to be obligatory, forbidden or permissible. Acts that fall within the category of the permissible in reason may be further specified by the revealed law, and such legal rulings follow deductively from God's wisdom. A God who is wise and powerful will realize human benefit, and human benefit is then the cause of those factors or causes that gives rise to specific legal rulings. In other words, and quote, God's wisdom gives rise to laws that serve the benefit of his creatures. Al-Shamsi, 2014, page 25. Al-Shamsi explains that these 10th century Shafis justify the validity of legal analogy with benefit, but do not use their theories of benefit to derive new legal rulings. Their aim is simply to provide an apologetic against those who would denigrate the rationality of God's law. The precise benefits of specific rulings are not knowable even though the law is known to be beneficial in general. This reminds Al-Shamsi of the 10th century Hanafi jurists Abul Hasan al-Qarqi, died 952, and Abu Bakr al-Jassas, died 980, and the distinction between the cause of a specific ruling on the one hand and the cause of benefit al-Jassas or the wise purpose al-Qarqi on the other. The cause of benefit or the wise purpose is a rule is not known in detail and cannot be used to establish the rule. The rule is established only by the legal cause, which is merely a sign or marker that God has given to indicate his ruling. Even though benefit is not considered when deriving specific rulings, the theological conviction remains that God in his wisdom brings about human benefit through the law. Al-Shamsi, 2014. Al-Shamsi then takes up Al-Ghazali, who turns the tables to integrate benefit into legal theory by moving it, and quote, out of the realm of theology and into the realm of law. Al-Shamsi, 2014, page 34. Unlike his Mu'tazili-inspired Shafi predecessors, Al-Ghazali does not deduce the beneficial character of the law from God's attribute of wisdom. Rather, he derives it inductively from the existing rules of the divine law itself. In other words, he works from the bottom up instead of the top down. For Al-Ghazali, as an Ash'ari theologian, God is not subject to objective ethical standards, and God's actions are not motivated by purposes or considerations of benefit. However, this does not prevent human beings from using reason to study the law and to infer that it promotes benefit. With this in mind, Al-Ghazali examines the rulings established in the law to discern its fundamental principles, and then he uses these principles to extend the law to other cases. For example, Al-Ghazali investigates the purpose of prohibiting intoxicants and discerns that it is protection of the intellect. Protecting the intellect is then taken to be one of the fundamental purposes of the law, Maqasid ash-Sharia. The other four purposes are protecting life, progeny, property, and religion. When the various purposes of the law have been established, they may be used as criteria to judge the suitability or appropriateness, munasaba, of particular characteristics to be legal causes and then draw these causes into a coherent framework of human benefit. According to Al-Shamsi, Al-Ghazali successfully turns benefit into an instrument of legal reasoning by banishing considerations of benefit from the realm of theology. Al-Shamsi stops with Al-Ghazali, but if we move forward another century, we find that Fakhruddin al-Razi elaborates much the same approach. Al-Razi in his Al-Muhassal fi Ilm Usul al-Fiqh concedes that God's acts and rulings are not caused by motives and purposes. Mu'alla bil dawa wal agraz. Mu'alla bil dawa'i wal agraz. Nonetheless, Al-Razi contends that there is a certain regularity about the revolutions of the celestial spheres, the movements of the constellations, and the fact that fire burns what it contacts. The repetition of these movements and events is not necessarily wajib, but rather a matter of God's custom, ada. In all probability, zan, these movements and patterns of activity will continue on in the future as they have in the past. In a similar manner, inductive examination of God's law reveals regular patterns of coincidence between rulings and benefits that will, in all probability, remain stable so as to form the basis for determining the suitability of various characteristics to be legal causes. However, these legal causes are in no way caused by divine purposes. Moreover, Ar-Razi argues it is sufficient to have only probable knowledge of the suitability of legal causes. Since probability is sufficient to establish a point of law, certainly is not required. We are now in a position to examine Ibn Taymiyya's critique of later Asharis like Al-Ghazali and Ar-Razi. His deductive and theological approach to the rationality of the law stands behind his accusation that the later Asharis contradict themselves. They detect benefit in God's law inductively but deny that it derives from purpose in God's will. Ibn Taymiyya also criticized the Asharis for grounding the suitability of the legal causes in God's custom rather than God's direct legislation, and he maintains that God explicitly legislates in order to attract benefit and repel detriment. Benefit and purpose in the law are not merely coincidences of God's legislative custom. Ibn Taymiyya writes, and quote, "Those among the later Asharis who uphold suitability, munasaba, say that what is suitable is taken into consideration in the revelation. They draw inferences on the basis of coincidence, iktaran only, not on the grounds that the legislator ruled what he ruled in order to obtain benefit, sought by means of the ruling or to repel detriment." End quote. Ibn Taymiyya also rejects a further feature of later Ashari legal theory, the unattested or unstated benefit, al-maslaha al-mursala. Al-Ghazali developed the category of unstated benefit to indicate benefits not mentioned in the revelation. This would appear to expand the use of benefit to derive new law extensively. However, not just any unstated benefit is suitable to be a legal cause. Al-Ghazali restricts suitability to those unstated benefits that conform to the 5 purposes of the law, namely preservation of religion, life, intellect, progeny, and property. Ibn Taymiyya criticizes the concept of unstated benefit from 2 directions. From one direction, deriving new law on the basis of unstated benefits is tantamount to legislating rulings that God did not authorize. This is unacceptable. From the other, legally sanctioned benefit is not limited to the so-called 5 purposes of the law. According to Ibn Taymiyya, many people working within this narrow framework neglect other legally prescribed benefits. The law includes all real benefits in both worldly and religious affairs, and there are in fact no benefits left unstated in revelation. If a benefit is a true benefit, revelation will have indicated it, and those who think otherwise are unaware. Ibn Taymiyya expresses the principle thus. The principle overall is that the law, Sharia, never neglects a benefit, maslaha. Indeed, God, exalted is He, has perfected the religion for us and completed the blessing. The Prophet, may God bless him and give him peace, has indeed spoken about everything that will bring us closer to the garden of paradise. One of 2 possibilities must obtain for the rational person who believes that something is a benefit, even though the revelation Sharia does not relate it. Either the revelation indicates it and the person looking into it does not know it, or it is not a benefit even though he believes it to be a benefit. Benefit is profit that accrues and predominates, and often people imagine that something is profitable in religion and in this world, when in fact its profit is outweighed by harm. As he exalted is he said about wine and gambling. And quote, "Say, in these 2 is a great sin and profits for the people. Their sin is greater than their profit." Quran, chapters 2, verse 219. This page makes readily apparent that Ibn Taymiyya is an apologist for the all-encompassing rationality of the law. The question then is whether Ibn Taymiyya's deductive approach to benefit in God's law and his claim that the law encompasses all benefits obviate substantive appeal to benefit in deriving specific rulings, much as it did for 10th century Mu'tazili-inspired Shafi'is. Does Ibn Taymiyya merely comb the revelation for all possible indications of benefit and not think substantively beyond the text? Felicitas Office and Sofia Veselo present opposing views on the question. In a monograph on benefit maslaha in the Islamic tradition, Office 2010, page 185 to 190, outlines Ibn Taymiyya's rejection of unstated benefit. And she clarifies that he does not follow later Asharis in using benefit to identify causes in legal analogies. However, she also notices that Ibn Taymiyyah permits anything not prohibited to meet the needs of humans for their livelihoods, and that he sometimes sets aside prohibitions on the basis of benefit, need, and necessity. For example, carrion is normally forbidden, but he allows a Muslim to eat it if necessary to avoid starvation. He also permits risk in sales to avoid the greater detriment of usury. Thus, a pregnant animal may be sold even though the value of the offspring is not yet known. Office 2010, 184 to 185 concludes from such examples that Ibn Taymiyyah uses benefit in a substantive manner to derive new rulings. She sums up and quote, Ibn Taymiyyah's interpretation of maslaha follows a substantive rationality that is more inclusive than that of Al-Ghazali, and includes anything that brings about benefit and averts harm. Every benefit that is not prohibited in the law is permitted, and in cases of need, maslaha can even overrule explicit prohibitions. Office 2010, page 198. Office furthermore perceives danger in Ibn Taymiyyah's method, as his reasoning lacks guidelines which assure some measure of accountability in the law-finding procedure. This results in an intellectual elitism that criticizes the rulings of others but provides no criteria by which to measure its own. Office 2010, page 198 to 199. In contrast to Office, Veselo finds claims to substantive legal rationality in Ibn Taymiyyah very thin. She explains that in the majority of his examples illustrating the need to weigh up benefit and harm, and quote, the preferred action has been established on scriptural grounds, end quote, and a consideration of benefit occurs, end quote, within the regulating framework of scripture, end quote. Veselo does note that Ibn Taymiyyah presumes permissibility in customary acts when no textual indicants prohibited them. But she counters that he also requires a positive demonstration that no prohibition exists. In the end, it is the revealed law that determines what is beneficial for human beings. Veselo argues that this is indeed the way it has been in light of Ibn Taymiyyah's theology. God, in his wise purpose and justice, sought to benefit humankind with prophecy, and we humans, and quote, should be able to believe that our sense of good and the lawgiver's sense of good coincide, end quote. In other words, it is Ibn Taymiyyah's faith conviction that the revealed law encompasses all human benefit, and he takes it upon himself to buttress this conviction with rational argument. Veselo observes that Ibn Taymiyyah's legal reflection uses reason to defend the all-encompassing benefit of the law, much as his theological production is an apologetic for the rationality of revelation. Veselo would appear to bring us back to viewing Ibn Taymiyyah after the fashion of the 10th century Shafi'is Al-Qafal and Al-Khafaf, with benefit playing no substantive role in the derivation of legal rulings. It is certainly clear that Ibn Taymiyyah does not integrate benefit into a formal system of legal cause derivation along the lines of Al-Ghazali and Ar-Razi. However, there is more to Ibn Taymiyyah's legal discourse on benefit than apologetics, and taking the perspective of both Office and Veselo together provides important insights. They are two sides of the same coin of a revelation-based authorization to engage in utilitarian, ethical, and jurisprudential reasoning. To unpack this, I first revisit a passage that Veselo used to show how Ibn Taymiyyah retains the priority of scriptural texts, even while speaking directly about weighing up benefits and detriments. The text is found in Ibn Taymiyyah's treatise on commanding the right and forbidding the wrong, and the question at hand is whether to intervene in the moral affairs of others. Here are the key parts of the passage in translation. It is divided into 4 paragraphs to facilitate reference. If benefits and detriments and good things and evil things contradict or complete with each other, then it is necessary to give preponderance to the preponderant of them. If commanding and prohibiting involve obtaining benefit and repelling detriment, what opposes carrying out this obligation must also be examined. If the benefits lost or the detriments obtained are greater, it is no longer commanded. On the contrary, it is forbidden if its detriment is greater than its benefit. However, the extent of the benefits and the detriments must be considered according to the scale of the law, Sharia. When someone can follow the texts, he should not deviate from them. If not, he should exercise independent reasoning, ijtihad bir ra'asi. Ijtihada bir ra'isi, to come to a knowledge of similar and corresponding cases. However, it is rare that texts will be lacking for those who are expert in them and their indications of legal rulings. If, therefore, an individual or a group faces a situation combining right and wrong such that they cannot differentiate between the two and such that they have to do both or omit doing both, it is not permissible to command only the right and prohibit only the wrong. On the contrary, one has to investigate. If the right is greater, it is commanded, even if it is necessarily entails wrong of lesser import. Wrong is not prohibited if it is necessarily entails losing right greater than it. Indeed, prohibiting in that case would be tantamount to blocking the way of God. Falling under this category is the indulgence of the Prophet, God bless him and give him peace, toward Abdullah bin Ubay and his like among the leaders of hypocrisy and immorality in view of their supporters being large in number. Putting an end to Ibn Ubay's wrong by punishing him would necessarily have entailed putting an end to something right that was greater than that, namely the fury and fervor of his people for advancing the cause of religion. People would have also found it distasteful that they heard that Muhammad SAW had killed one of his companions in punishment. Wesselo in her argument draws only to the first two paragraphs above. She quotes most of the first paragraph as a remarkable methodological statement of Ibn Taymiyyah's call to use one's own judgment in balancing utility in commanding and forbidding. She then quotes much of the second paragraph to show that Ibn Taymiyyah closes the door on the prospect of a more substantive evaluative judgment. Texts are decisive in weighing up benefit and detriment, and those who do know the texts well will not be lacking for guidance. Reading all four paragraphs together adds nuance. The structure of the passage does indeed express Ibn Taymiyyah's confidence that the law encompasses all benefits, but in a certain fashion. Twice over, in the first and third paragraphs, Ibn Taymiyyah instructs his readers to weigh up benefits and detriments before commanding or prohibiting an action. After the first instruction, he directs readers to subject their actions to the scale of the law, as there will almost always be a relevant text. Yet, if they cannot find a text, they should resort to independent reasoning on the basis of similar cases. Then in the fourth paragraph, Ibn Taymiyyah grounds the instruction to weigh a benefit and detriment in the precedent of the Prophet's indulgent dealings with Abdullah bin Ubay. Here the precedent simply establishes the utilitarian principle. It does not indicate the ruling for a specific case in Ibn Taymiyyah's time and place. The import of this passage is both that the revealed law is the measure of true benefit and the law provides the principle for ethical and jurisprudential reasoning in utilitarian calculation. Textual indicants may not be clear or ready to hand for every specific situation, and this requires weighing up the benefit and detriment of an action for religion. The centrality of utilitarian reasoning to Ibn Taymiyyah's ethics and jurisprudence becomes even clearer in a text that Wesselo does not consider, his treatise on the Caliphate, which I will dub Khilafah and which runs to 15 pages in volume 35 of Majmu' al-Fatawa. In Khilafah, Ibn Taymiyyah joins together substantive and apologetic aspects of his legal methodology, and a review of his treatise will serve to illustrate how he both deploys the weighing up of benefit and detriment as a substantial legal and ethical source, and then again grounds such utilitarian reasoning in the practice of the Prophet. This treatise is also of interest because it shows how Ibn Taymiyyah addresses the difficulty that the ideal caliphate of the rightly guided no longer existed in his time. It will become apparent that part of Ibn Taymiyyah's resort to utilitarian reasoning stems from his conviction that sin and weakness plague the human condition and must be taken into account. Ibn Taymiyyah begins Khilafah with a prophetic tradition stating that, and quote, the caliphate of prophecy, Khilafat al-Nubuwah, will last 30 years before kingship, mulk, sets in. He links the caliphate of prophecy to the four rightly guided caliphs, al-Khulafa al-Rashidun, Abu Bakr, Umar, Usman, and Ali, and the beginning of kingship to the reign of Muawiyah. Ibn Taymiyyah allows that there were more caliphs than just the four rightly guided, and he permits calling kings caliphs as well. even if they do not attain the perfection of the prophetic caliphate. Ibn Taymiyyah maintains that the caliphate of prophecy, or what he calls the practice of the caliph, Sunnat al-Khulafa, is fundamentally a matter of obligation for the Muslim community. Kingship is only permissible in case of need, haja, deriving from a lack of knowledge or power. Kingship is not permissible in itself, and it involves a failure to uphold part of the religion. Ibn Taymiyyah also mentions the view that a caliphate tarnished by kingship, Shaub al-Khilafa bil-Mulk, is permissible, and two extreme positions that he clearly rejects. One is that of the Kharijis, Mu'tazilis, and others from whom kingship is never permissible, even in case of need. The other extreme is to permit kingship absolutely without reference to the practice of the caliphs. The challenge facing Ibn Taymiyyah is bridging the moral distance between the continuing obligation of the caliphate of prophecy and the reality of kingship in his day. He observes that omitting the caliphate of prophecy when it is in fact possible is blameworthy and subject to punishment. But he asks, is it a major sin, kabira, or a minor sin, sagira? Ibn Taymiyyah claims that the text of the Quran and the Sunnah favor the view that this depends on whether the king's good deeds outweigh his evil deeds, and whether his good deeds exceed the good deeds of someone who commits no evil deeds at all. Failure to fulfill the obligation of the caliphate of prophecy is not necessarily a major sin, Ibn Taymiyyah. This matter of weighing up the good deeds and the evil deeds of those exercising kingship leads Ibn Taymiyyah to the broader question of how to assess good deeds that will not be committed unless accompanied by evil deeds. This phenomenon, he says, appears in two forms. In the first, the good deed is impossible without the evil deed, in which case the evil deed is in fact no longer evil. The so-called evil deed is obligatory or recommended if it is essential to the performance of another obligatory or recommended deed. If the detriment of the so-called evil deed is less than the benefit of the good deed, then the so-called evil deed is not forbidden, as when someone eats carrion to survive or wears slick to protect against the cold. Ibn Taymiyyah complains that many people fail to understand the logic of needs and detriments. They ignore the needs that make some forbidden acts permitted, or they fail to see the detriment may render recommended or obligatory acts forbidden, as in the case of ritual prayer for someone who is ill, of ritual purification for someone on the verge of death. Ibn Taymiyyah applies this reasoning to restate the permissibility of deviation from the prophetic caliphate in case of inability to adhere to some of its practices. Sometimes the obligations of political or administrative authority can only be fulfilled by means of some lesser harm. The second form in which good and evil deeds mix, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, is when a good deed could be committed without an evil deed, but only with difficulty. In reality, people cannot bring themselves to commit this good deed without also engaging in something prohibited to help them through. Something for, and quote, whose sinfulness is less than the profit, manafa, of the good deed. Ibn Taymiyyah observes that this form of good deed occurs frequently across all sectors of society, ranging from rulers and scholars to Sufis and the general populace. He cites a number of examples. An example is someone who cannot bring himself to achieve the benefits of administrative authority in commanding the right and prohibiting the wrong, carrying out the prescribed punishments, hudud, squaring the roads, undertaking jihad against the enemy, and distributing resources without engaging in some prohibited things like expropriating some of the resources, domineering the people, showing favoritism in distribution, and other such capricious behaviors. It is likewise in jihad, he is not able to bring himself to undertake jihad without a certain kind of rashness. In scholarship, he is not able to bring himself to study the science of jurisprudence and the foundations of religion without certain kinds of prohibited things, like exercising his own opinion rai and engaging in rationalist theology. And he cannot bring himself to study the science of legislated rites of worship and the knowledge that is commanded without a certain kind of monkishness, rahabaniya. Within this last example, the scholar who indulges in a bit of monkishness, Ibn Taymiyyah, may well have himself in mind, and Yahya Mikot takes this passage to the key to unlocking the mystery of the celibacy. Ibn Taymiyyah never married, even though he believed that a Muslim man should do so, suggested that he saw this as a perverse side effect of his devotion to piety and scholarship. Ibn Taymiyyah continues in Khulafa, explaining that this phenomenon of indulging in evil deeds to make more beneficial deeds bearable is widespread among kings and others, and that it has caused considerable strife and confusion. However, even though the revealed law does not authorize or excuse such evil deeds, it does command rulers to do good deeds, and they should do those good deeds even if that involves committing evil deeds of less import. Ibn Taymiyyah gives the example of jihad. Amirs are commanded to undertake jihad even if it is known that they will not undertake jihad without a certain kind of injustice whose detriment is less in comparison to the benefit of jihad. Moreover, explains Ibn Taymiyyah, rulers should not be prohibited from evil deeds if prohibition might dissuade them from performing good deeds that yield benefit outweighing the detriment of those evil deeds. Sometimes permitting an evil deed leads to greater good all around. Ibn Taymiyyah cites an example concerning the second Sunni Caliph and quote, Umar bin al-Khattab employed an immoral person because of the preponderance of benefit in using him, and he put an end to his immorality through his strength and justice. At other times, omitting prohibition of a wrong averts another wrong that would be even more detrimental. As an example, Ibn Taymiyyah notes that a king who converts to Islam should not be prohibited from drinking wine if prohibition would lead him to apostatize. Nevertheless, Ibn Taymiyyah observes there will also be times when prohibitions must be made plain to achieve other ends. It all depends on the circumstances, and for Ibn Taymiyyah, the precedent for such prudent discernment is found in the Prophet. And quote, because of the diversity of the circumstances, the position of the Prophet, may God bless him and give him peace, varied regarding his command, his prohibition, his jihad, his pardon, his carrying out of the prescribed punishments, his harshness and his mercy. The final appeal to the Prophet in Khilafah could be interpreted to give divine sanction to unbridled utilitarianism as normative Islam. The commands and prohibitions of the law are subject to prudential strategizing and even expandable. This is the worry of Opis. However, such a reading misses the role of human failure in Ibn Taymiyyah's deliberations. The Muslim community is indeed obligated to fulfill the caliphate of prophecy and prohibited from eating carrion and drinking wine. The greatest benefit is to be found in observing such obligations and prohibitions. However, Ibn Taymiyyah in Khilafah discusses what to do when that is not possible due to sin and human weakness. What is to be done is to make the best of a sinful world by weighing up benefits versus detriments in order to advance the cause of religion and draw closer to the revealed law in the best way possible. This too finds its support in Revelation. It's the way of Prophet. Office is right that Ibn Taymiyyah deploys benefit substantially in his juristic and ethical reasoning, and Westlaw is also correct that Ibn Taymiyyah traces all benefit back to Revelation. The two views may be reconciled by seeing that for Ibn Taymiyyah, Revelation sanctions substantive utilitarian reasoning oriented toward the greater good of the Muslim community and ever fuller obedience to the commands of the God. This utilitarian reasoning is not independent of an ultimate aim revealed by God, but it does require making substantive judgments about the relative benefit of adhering to legal rulings in the many circumstances that fall short of the ultimate aim. It is the rule for how to proceed when following God's law is not fully possible. Conclusion. Our study of Ibn Taymiyyah's Irada has yielded two major results concerning his theology. First, the Avicennan notion of God's self-love giving rise to the world as a necessary concomitant provides Ibn Taymiyyah with the philosophical resources to portray God as the self-interested, perpetual creator of the world. Second, his temporalization of the essence of this God enables him to depict him as a dynamic utilitarian agent, maximizing benefit for both himself and human beings through the historical process. Some things like rain may cause harm to some people for a time, but God creates preponderant good and the best possible world all over. Shifting to Ibn Taymiyyah's ethics and legal reflection, he affirms that God's revealed law encompasses all human benefit pertaining to both this world and the hereafter, and that maximum human benefit is to be found in total obedience to the law. However, human ignorance of relevant revealed texts and human sin and weakness mean that it is not always possible to adhere to the law perfectly, and so utilitarian calculation must be made between competing courses of action to ascertain the best way to advance religion. Ibn Taymiyyah in his treatise on the Caliphate and his treatise on commanding the right and forbidding the wrong stipulates weighing up the benefits and detriments of acts so as to attain the greatest benefit or avert the greatest detriment, and he grounds this in the example of the Prophet. Ibn Taymiyyah states at the beginning of Irada that the issue of causality pervades everything to do with theology and law. Moreover, the treatise makes apparent that his view of causality is utilitarian in orientation, and it rejects Ashari voluntarism in God's will. It thus comes as no surprise that he can observe marked parallels between God and humans in their utilitarian agency. Ibn Taymiyya's God does the best possible creating and commanding in a world beset with evils. Likewise, humans should follow the Prophet in choosing preponderant benefit for religion as they act in a world beset by ignorance, sin, and weakness. Ibn Taymiyyah does not resolve the problems of evil, sin, and human weakness in the texts considered in this study, but if we fill out the implications of his arguments for universal salvation, these problems will find ultimate resolution in the hereafter when God will bring everyone to obey and worship Him alone, when benefit will be full and complete for all. As a theologian, ethicist, and jurist, Ibn Taymiyyah provides an Abyssinian informed apology for the utilitarian rationality of God's creation and God's command. What God creates is the best possible, and what God commands through the revealed law encompasses all benefit. This law not only specifies obligations and prohibitions, it also provides the Prophet's exemplary utilitarianism as the operative principle when perfect obedience to obligation and prohibitions is too difficult or impossible. Ibn Taymiyyah thus places great weight on human calculation for ascertaining the best course of action in everyday circumstances. Such calculations are, of course, subject to the limitations of human knowledge of both texts and actual benefits, and thus leading to different judgments about the most beneficial way to promote religious flourishing. This observation applies even to Ibn Taymiyyah's own corpus, as it has often been noted that his writings are occasional and circumstantial in character, and his views are not easily systematized. Nonetheless, modern research is increasingly bringing out consistencies of theme, purpose, and vision in his thought. Ibn Taymiyyah's diverse interventions reflect a religious utilitarianism, ever seeking the most effective way to point readers toward what he believed to be in everyone's best interest, full obedience to God. And he supports this with the theology of God's utilitarian activity, working toward that same goal.